Ibrahim, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Joshua. Great to be here.
So before we get sort of into the details, I'd love for you to sort of just share your own experience of how you've ended up working in the football industry and how it's all sort of come about for yourself.
Yeah, so thank you for having me. So, just to give you a bit of a background into myself, so I'm naturally a marketer. My evolution into marketing is basically was a result of me being interested in businesses, and being sort of like a business sort of like focus. I basically try to gobble up as much information from different industries. I've worked in the tech industry. But for me personally, it's about trying to see where can I leverage insights from different segments of industries to be able to focus on trying to create value and value change. Specifically around football, the opportunity arose because I felt that I've been a football fan for a while. I should start with that. I'm a Man U fan. Obviously, not a good time to be a Manchester United fan. But yeah, so I started watching football when I was 6, probably younger because of David Beckham. And yeah, you feel like as a consumer, you feel very attached to the sport itself. You feel in love. You fell in love with the sport because of the artistry, and not because of the business to begin with. But then, as you go into a career, you go into an industry, you start to develop insights. You start to sharpen your understanding of not just business but commerce, but also ability to touch the hearts of customers, in this case, fans. And yeah, the reason for going into football to begin with was because I felt it was a natural sort of fit for me as a person who has a marketing background, but at the same time, a person who has a very strong understanding of the football industry from an outsider perspective, which is as a fan consuming it. But at the same time, I felt that there were opportunity gaps that me specifically could be able to add a narrative, but also to be able to unearth value, as my sort of like my bio description says. Yeah.
Brilliant. No, I think it gives a real opening into sort of your background and how you sort of entered the industry. One of the things that from what you just said, was found really interesting is the idea of marketing to fans. We've just had a conversation with Ryan McKnight, and one of the things that he was speaking about was the lack of connection that football clubs now have with their local communities, essentially, as the sort of the marketplace becomes more global and it's more sort of there's more praise on sort of the relationship with international consumers rather than local identity. From your sort of advisor, from the work that you've done, where do you sort of see that? Is that somewhere that the football industry is just going global and that's just the way things are? Or do you think there is a position for football clubs to sort of take a more locally focused marketing approach where they sort of re-engage and sort of reflect the values of the local communities better in the way in which they sort of operate off the pitch, but also on the pitch? You see a lot of international players now, which is great for the profile and the elevation of the standard of the game. But you look at other football clubs, especially in like a Real Betis or other football clubs globally, that take a more like academy focused approach where they want to promote people from their local area to play for their team. So where do you sort of see sort of the local identity / globalization thing going from a fan point of view?
So I should sort of caveat this by saying at Berlin Growth Advisory, we're really at the early stages when it comes to sort of like making our impact in the industry, not just in the UK, but also around Europe, specifically because we're in Germany, also Berlin. But I would say from what I've seen so far, in terms of like localization versus globalization, I would say that you want to make sure that you have like a very strong foundation to build on any sort of like market expansion strategy when it comes to local clubs. First of all, clubs should be focused on trying to understand what are the needs of their local market in terms of like what are the community values. I wrote a paper on my Substack, I'm not trying to plug it, but which I'm going to publish on the newsletter for Berlin Growth, basically trying to understand what our sporting directors should be focused on in terms of their key roles and responsibilities. And one of those things I highlighted there was basically a sporting director should understand what the community needs and values are. There's a book called The Real Madrid Way, which is very sort of like prevalent when it comes to understanding community needs and understanding sporting success. And what the book tried to convey is basically that Real Madrid, which is this big behemoth sort of like institution that we all admire, at least as a neutral fan, they understand what the needs of the local markets are, but at the same time, they try to make sure it's balanced off. I mean, balance is a very loaded word, but they try to make sure that they don't sort of like tilt too far away from the local market, at the same time committing to meeting the needs of the expanded global markets around the globe. So for me personally, what I think that we're speaking specifically around English clubs, there should be a very strong rooting within within the local markets. Wrexham, for instance, is a good example. I've not done a deep dive on Wrexham and Ryan Reynolds and Rob, their strategy, but from what I've seen so far is that they came in with humility. They understood that this is a club with history. Obviously, they had some tailwinds to begin with because the club has a rich history. But they figured out that for this to be a good story to tell, which is what they are, storytellers, they felt that they had to understand how to ground the club in its local community values. So I'm sure they did focus groups. I'm sure they did surveys. I'm sure they got close to the customer, the consumer, the local market itself. And then they decided to try to bridge the gap between that and where they could tell the story where it fits with the global market. And this is what clubs, if they're thinking about how can we balance or how can we find a way to make sure that we are not leaving potential opportunities to engage with our local market, while at the same time not be left behind by the ever expanding global reach of soccer or football, as we call it here, then there needs to be that mentality or mental model that we have to root ourselves in the fact that we have a history. Our club has communities. We need to make sure that we're serving the community at the same time, making sure the community understands that for this club to be successful, both financially and sporting wise, we need to be able to reach all the audiences outside. If we don't do it, other institutions will, and we'll get left behind. If we get left behind, it just doesn't impact the financials of the club itself, meaning the owners and the club staff, but it impacts the community itself because the club actually serves as an institution, which helps with job growth and other aspects of community building. So I would say that.
Apologies for taking you away from the podcast, but this will be really quick. We've launched our football business community. What that is everyone that's a guest on this podcast is part of this community. So if you would like to network with our guests, this is the place to do so. We have a live Q&A with every podcast guest on, so you can ask your questions rather than just listening to mine. If it's something that sounds interesting to you, there's a discount code in the description below. Use it, click the link, join the community. Right, that's all for me. Let's get back to the podcast.
Yeah, I think that's a really sort of complete answer in terms of the way in which clubs should be looking at this. I like the idea of sort of like the storytelling aspect and really understanding what your local community needs and what they are, and the only way that happens is through effective sort of fan engagement. And there's been a lot of sort of talk around the subject of fan engagement and what is fan engagement and what they now you see clubs sort of understanding the importance of that and hiring sort of like supported liaison officers, which is sort of like the fancy term now. What sort of, from your point of view, if a football club is going down that route and they've decided to take on a role for that person to like, we're going to hire someone to specifically look at the needs of our fans, what do you think what should be sort of like their main focus? What if you were sort of going to build the perfect football liaison officer, like what should their day-to-day be doing? How should they be sort of making sure that they're sort of engrossed in the fan experience and what the fan culture is? Like how do you become good at that is what I'm trying to say. How do clubs become good at that?
I mean, if I'm offering this advice to a club, I'd first of all say, let's look at internally, what do we have? What are the previous sort of like success engagement strategies that we've had in terms of trying to engage with fans, in terms of trying to make sure that that was obviously beneficial from an ROI perspective, but also on a balance sheet perspective. But yeah, the first thing would be to look at that internally. What sort of like resources do we have? What sort of like key indicators have we had so far that have shown that we've been successful? If not, if we have nothing, we're starting from scratch. It's about trying to build sort of like stakeholder collaborations. And you do that by basically trying to make sure you understand the market. You do that also, you understand the market by trying to obviously do surveys, like I mentioned previously. So you're doing research in this sense, and the research helps you understand how to refine, how to sort of like laser in on a specific sort of like strategy. And this is how it starts. You build it from there. In terms of trying to the key responsibilities, and what I would see as a fan liaison officer, you're trying to make sure that you are bringing a fresh understanding of what a fan needs in this sort of like generation. So we have different demographics, we have different gender groups, we have different age brackets. You know, you have fans that don't consume in the traditional way as a fan who's in his 40s. I think Kieran Maguire, who's the host of The Price of Football, I think he mentioned that the average fan, the average age of a sort of like a consumer in the Premier League is probably in the mid 40s, which is striking, you know, because you see the Premier League or the football industry is marketed as a sport for people of all ages. But if you're hearing that that's the average sort of like age brackets in the Premier League, that shows you that a lot of things need to change for football to become relevant. So a fan liaison officer should be focused on trying to make sure that the next generation of football fans are keyed in, and we have a strategy to meet them where they need to be met. And the first would be also trying to understand where are they consuming their football. You know, what are the consumption habits? You do that by going where they are. You know, football fans consume, Gen Z, for instance, consume football on different platforms. You know, they consume football on TikTok, on YouTube, you know, highlight reels. I know there's this show, the CBS show with Jamie Carragher, Henry, and Michael Richards. And every time they ask a question about, you know, who's your favorite on this show, you know, they're shocked that the footballer knows the show, especially the younger ones. I think Lamine Yamal was mentioning that he saw one of the sort of like the commentators sort of like segments on TikTok, and then that explains to you that okay, a 17-year-old superstar is telling you that I consume my football sort of like content on TikTok. So a fan liaison officer should be digitally aware of all the intricacies of TikTok as a platform to engage with fans. And it also comes to understanding what is working in other growth markets. So how can we engage with fans in sort of like emerging markets, sort of like South America, for instance, or in the US? What playbooks can we take from other parts of the world that are working? And you don't need to focus on just the football industry. You can take engagement insights from the women's football or women's sports. You can take engagement insights from the Olympics. You know, how do big Olympic events go global in terms of engagements, in terms of growth? And how does the NBA do it? How does the MLS do it? How does the MLB do it? If anything, I think a fan liaison officer should be focused on what are the Americans doing and do better than them. Take exactly what they're doing and try to personalize it to the football industry in Europe specifically, and try to improve on it in terms of like the key indicators. So that's what that would be the advice I'd give.
No, it's pretty interesting. I think the looking at best practice is always, you know, solid advice, whether or not it's the American market, whether it's, you know, I think the South American market in the way in which they engage with fans, not necessarily on a monetary point of view, because the leagues aren't as strong as some of the, obviously, especially if you're talking American other sports, especially if you're talking about NFL and things. But if you ever watch any of the sort of the games, the football games of South American leagues, like the fans and the atmosphere and the loyalty and dedication they have to their clubs is still very, very strong. And I think it's clear that we're shifting away from that almost as we go more aiming towards sort of international consumers who don't necessarily have the same allegiance because it's not their local identity, it's not their sort of local area, is really clear to see. And it's interesting to see that, you know, the way in which football goes is not necessarily a good or a bad thing, but you cannot, you know, lose that connection with your local community for the international fan expansion. And although it's naturally more international through TikTok and all the rest of it, and that's how people are consuming their sports sort of intake at the moment, they still need to make sure that that local community is sort of protected. And if not, all football clubs will just be sort of like a generic brand of football club rather than actually their own identity. So it's all really, really interesting. From the conversations you've sort of hosted on your own podcast, I know it's obviously around sort of the more financial aspects. So like what are the sort of more interesting sort of topics that have come up in the discussions that you've had? And what are your thoughts on the general financial position of football at the moment? I know we're in a real sort of key time right now, especially with an independent regulator coming into the English game. What are your sort of perspectives on that?
Yeah, I think first of all, yeah, we've recorded, I think, probably 8 or 7 episodes so far. We have a lot of guests already tallied up so far, but we have 3 recordings up now. But my sort of like take or my understanding from what the guests have shown, specifically the most recent ones, is that we're in for a very turbulent time when it comes to the football industry. I mean, the independent regulator, David Cogan, who has like a very sort of impressive CV in terms of like, I mean, he negotiated like the broadcasting rights for the Premier League to begin with. So he's well positioned to understand how can we rein in these sort of like the disparity between the haves and have-nots in terms of like the Big Six, in terms of the Premier League and the EFL. But from what I see so far is that football is in for reckoning in terms of like trying to make sure that sustainability is, in terms of financial sustainability is actually taken seriously. We need to try to incentivize the need for less accountants as opposed to where we are right now. I think there's this thing where when you have a regulation, the regulators themselves do not understand what they're supposed to regulate in the first place. So that happens not just in football, but in all industries. And the first thing a regulatory sort of like, policy should take into account is that you need to understand what you're regulating to begin with. You need to understand the industry you're regulating. And that says the same. That's the same thing I would say for football to begin with. The other thing I would say also is that football in general should be focused on trying to make sure that we don't lose sight on what made us fall in love with football. I mean, my podcast is focused on finance, as you say, but I still follow football. I still watch football. I mean, I watched the Inter Milan versus Barcelona last night. I think up till midnight we were watching that match, and that reignited my love for football, if I'm being honest. But yeah, I don't want to see football become a plaything for billionaires in that sense. I don't want it to be a thing where it's like, let's see who has more money to burn, essentially. And that's what it's been for I think more than 10 years now. I think since Abramovich came in. And yeah, I do encourage the sort of like the entrance of David Cogan as the independent regulator. But I also think he's well positioned to understand how to make sure that we don't scare growth for the Premier League and the football industry in the UK. But at the same time, I think he needs to understand that we need to strike sort of like a balance when it comes to making sure that the rest of the pyramid benefits, but not at the expense of the opportunities for further growth for the Premier League. Because at the end of the day, you ask the EFL sort of like stakeholders, they'll tell you no Premier League, no growth for the rest of the pyramid. So if they're not growing, the rest of the pyramid will not grow. And that might come across as a strong take, but I think it's an honest take. We need to make sure that they are also being kept in a position to continue to grow, but sustainably. At the same time, there needs to be enough for the rest of the pyramid to benefit, where they can also say, we can see growth potential, we can encourage outside investments. I mean, we can find creative ways to rely less on sort of like broadcasting deals or March day tickets and look for other opportunities to grow revenues. And I've sort of like looked at this in different ways. There are other opportunities for these clubs to embark on, but it takes courage. It takes one club to do it, and then the rest follow through. But it seems like with everything in life, people are scared to try something new.
No, I completely agree. When you talk about new revenue streams, what are some of the ideas, or some of the things that football clubs could be implementing to sort of bring new revenue into their operations?
Yeah, I sent out a post today, and basically the second part of that post was basically talking about how football clubs have youth teams. And if I ask you now, Joshua, when was the last time you watched a youth game?
Yeah. When I was a youth and I was playing in it, not watch. Yeah, I don't think I've ever watched. Oh, that might not be true, but years ago.
Yeah, it's so that's my point exactly. So you have, I would say the same also personally, but you have this sort of like undervalued asset, which is the youth team, and it's not being utilized properly. It reminds me of the women's football sort of like part of like the football industry. It's just been lingering there. And obviously, women's football was banned for 50 years, but now we're seeing growth potential there. and I'm very happy about that. But in terms of the youth team, you see that as an asset that's not being utilized properly. And I think it's because clubs do not understand that there's opportunities everywhere. Football clubs specifically have this sort of like, not whatever the opposite of a growth mindset is, they have that. They have this limited mindset, which is, oh, okay, we only have broadcasting deals. We have to rely on sort of like parachute payments from the Premier League and so on and so forth, and the League One have to do the same for the Championship. No, you have the opportunities to actually discover new revenue streams. And I mentioned that youth team for a reason. So clubs can actually tell stories around the youth team. Lamine Yamal is 17. Okay, you'd say, okay, he's a 1 in a million. But I guarantee you that's not the case in terms of relatively. He obviously is an outlier, but in terms of talent at that stage, there are a lot of talented players at that stage. Trevor Morris, the talented footballer that obviously could not make it at Manchester United for reasons that we're going to. But imagine watching him. I'm sure you've heard a lot of commentary about how good he was. He was the best in his cohort in terms of like Pogba being there, Lindegaard being there, and he was the best in his cohort. Imagine being able to watch him as a 17-year-old, 18-year-old, 19-year-old football consumer or football fan. And that's exactly what I'm talking about. People watch people that are similar to them. So if you want to unearth value when it comes to the youth team, you need to tell stories that would resonate with kids at that similar age bracket. So tell stories around why they have this skill set. Tell stories about how they got into football to begin with. Tell stories about how they developed this skill or how they went through trials and tribulations. But the fact that those kids are there and they're just looking for ways to go into the first team, and that's all they have as a path, I think that's concerning. But that will be the first one. The second one I would say also is football clubs, and this is something I'm looking into, is football clubs to look at basically licensing their women's football teams. I'm talking about clubs outside of the Big Six. So clubs who cannot afford, which is a strong word, but clubs who cannot afford to basically have an affiliated women's team, they should license that women's team out as a brand, but keep the team itself as their ownership, but license it out and obviously benefit from the licensing deal incrementally growing. So those are the two opportunities I would say. But obviously we have storytelling and so on and so forth. But yeah.
Yeah, I think there's so many opportunities. I agree with you. I think there's so many different ways that football could be utilised in what it currently has better. I think one of the things that football clubs don't utilise well enough is their commercial partnerships, and I'm talking even at a lower level in the pyramid, because I feel like you can produce really good offers to fans in connection with your commercial partners. So, for example, especially lower down the pyramid, if you've got connections with local businesses, local shops, all the rest of it, and it could be for season ticket holders, it could be just an additional offer that you sell, but it could be like essentially like a discount code to all of your commercial partners. Be like, look, if you're a season ticket holder, you get 10% off at the local butcher, or you get a free haircut at the local hairdressers, and you make it then more about the community. You build it around local partners, and then all of a sudden you can almost make the value of the season ticket worthwhile, even if no one turned up on a match day, because they've got all these other benefits. I'm not saying people should start not turning up on a match day. My point is, the way in which you can utilize your partners to add more value to things that you offer, whether you use the season ticket as a vehicle or you use other things. I think that just utilizing the partners that they have, utilizing the space and the structure that they have. A lot of stadiums are very much underutilized in terms of, function rooms and the creativity and how much they can monetize these spaces. I think it's really important, like you say, youth team, women's team, there's hundreds of opportunities. It's more so just being able to identify what works for that specific club, what's going to give them the biggest return, how is it going to improve them, what impact is it again going to have on the fans, and then the research and everything. We talk about the support liaison officer role. What impact, do the fans agree with the direction that you want to be taking the football club? And I think this is, if you can get the fans on board with the direction of travel, I think that's really, really key, because then you get more buy-in. And I think the one thing that sort of like separates fans from owners a lot of the time is the fact that they don't agree with the direction which the football club's being taken.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, sorry, jump in, but I do what you're saying resonates with me, and I do agree with it. I would say to add to that, clubs should look at potentially trying to leverage the history. So you mentioned fans and trying to understand what fans want, and this is something that clubs can leverage. Do a deep dive into what stories do fans want to hear. So now I guarantee you, if you do like a survey and to try to determine what top 5 stories would fans want to hear of a local club, you'd find like opportunities to sell that story to other markets. For instance, the perfect market would be the US market, where soccer, as they say, is growing, exponentially. Telling those stories outside of the Wrexham playbook, telling those stories to those markets to help them understand the history behind those clubs is a perfect commercial way to grow revenue. And then obviously you can go through comic books in terms of that. You can go to merchandise in terms of that. You can go into kids staples in terms of that. So opportunities are endless. It's just the way, the mindset, the lens you want to look through it.
do you think that the biggest opportunity in expansion right now is the American market? Obviously, we've mentioned it a few times now in terms of best practice for fan engagement, talked about sort of like the growth as the run up to the World Cups coming up. Do you think that's the one opportunity that football clubs should be sort of aiming towards? And obviously, we've seen it in really recently that obviously Reading looks like the takeover is going to be American owners. I think Colchester have just also been taken over by American owners. So we're getting more and more American investors into the English game. And obviously they've noticed that opportunity as more people have come sort of attracted to the sport over in the US. Do you think that's like the number one thing that football clubs should be looking at now in terms of how do they leverage this opportunity? How do they make sure they sort of like enter the market and sort of tell their story and grab a large portion of the American market as it's sort of entering into the interest in football?
Yeah, I do actually. I mean, this is the age-old question: is where is the next growth opportunity? But the growth opportunity, I mean, there's a question that was posed to someone. The person was asked, when is football going to, blossom in the US? And the person said it already has. Football is already there. It's like a top 4 sport, like literally. So in my opinion, I would say that the US is the only market for growth opportunities. Why? Because they have the market is already ready for this sport in terms of European football. And then there's this stat that goes around where it says in 83 million US fans and of soccer, and 33 million on the side in terms of what clubs do they support. I mean, that's a striking stat. But to look at it from a holistic perspective, the US market is a battlefield for the next 2 years in that sense. Because why? We have the World Cup coming up next year. We have the Club World Cup coming up in a few weeks literally. And then you have the post effects of those sort of like marketing campaigns and activations that happen. And what you want to see is clubs actually prioritizing, trying to understand unique ways that are unique to the club itself in terms of how can we leverage certain demographic, a certain parts of the US, and certain understanding of what sort of needs do they want in terms of like a club they want to associate with, and how can we then present ourselves that is unique to us, but at the same time personalize it to the sort of like the fan base or potential fan base we're looking at. The other thing I would say, obviously, there are other markets that could be considered, but you need to be careful in the sense that these markets have strong sort of like football club associations already. So, for instance, the Asian market is heavily dominated by Real Madrid, by Manchester United to a certain point, by Barcelona. It's going to be very tough for local or lower league teams to be able to leverage these markets because it requires even more spend, it requires even more expenditure in that sense. For instance, the South American market on its own is also challenging because they have legacy football clubs. Pele was from there, Maradona was from there. So trying to penetrate those markets is very tough, and this is why the US market is a key market. It's the battleground for potential revenue growth, and clubs should look at it as the next frontier of growth opportunities for football clubs. And if you're not looking at it, you're getting left behind.
Is there any football clubs? Obviously, we mentioned Wrexham a few times, but other than Wrexham, what football clubs do you think are doing well at this? Have you noticed sort of any football clubs that are positioning themselves well to take advantage of this opportunity? Is there any football clubs where you think actually, yeah, what they're doing is going to help them gain traction in the American market, or like what sort of things that other than sort of like the storytelling aspect? Is there other ways in which football clubs can position themselves to take advantage of this opportunity?
Yeah, so this is going to sound a bit elitist in sense of football. So obviously, the multi-club ownership model is a way to go, and obviously, what that means is that a club has the ability to have a club has the ability to be a parent company and have clubs under it in that sense, and under it in the sense that have different clubs in different parts or regions in the world. Man City is one example that is doing that well. And Man City does this well because obviously they have the financial power to do it. And what they're doing is basically being able to leverage the different, not just the best practices, but also the insights they gain from each part of the world to then feed that back into City and then have the like a unifying loop where it goes back to the other regions in that sense. Man City will be one. The team is, impressive. You probably know more than me in terms of how they operate. But from an outside looking in, it looks like they're very focused on the next growth opportunity when it comes to the American market. Other ones would be, I do think the AC Milan is one to look at. I was watching sort of like a segment that there's this guy called I Show Speed. So he's like a Gen Z streamer, and he has grown tremendously only because of his association with football. I only say only because I don't watch him, I don't follow him that much, but I follow him because obviously I'm in this space. I need to understand who are the people impacting football for the next generation. And I watched a segment where he went to Milan to meet Zlatan Ibrahimovic, and I could see the strategy behind AC Milan incorporating itself with this sort of like Gen Z streamer or YouTuber, and it links into the fact that they have a strategy behind the operation. They have an idea of what they're trying to achieve, and that's one aspect. Affiliating or associating yourself with influencers that obviously would help the brand become more aware. In terms of this key market. But I would say for clubs in general, it's just trying to make sure that you have insider knowledge in terms of trying to focus on what could work for you as opposed to trying to have a scattergun approach. Bayern Munich is another one, I would say. They have a very good operation in terms of trying to capitalize on the US market. As you probably are aware that in Germany, for instance, is a big love of anything US. I've been here for a while now. I would say this is true from my understanding. So obviously we know why, because of the history of Germany in terms of post World War II. But American football is very big here. And Bayern Munich leverages that in terms of understanding that they're obviously a big German club, the number one club in Germany, and they leverage their understanding of the American mentality. And a lot of I'm going to go into economics now, but a lot of Germany's exports obviously are going to US and very heavily dependent on the export model. So Germany would be one that clubs could Bayern Munich would be one that clubs could look at in terms of how to enter into the US market.
Do you think that this is one of if you're a football club from not the Premier League, if you're non-Premier League clubs, do you think this isn't one of the sort of the key opportunities for one of the other top sort of leagues in the world to sort of compete with the Premier League? If they can, if they can position, say, La Liga as one of the most watched leagues in the US, or Serie A or Bundesliga, do you think that if sort of a combined approach by clubs and leagues, do we think we'll see that over in the US? I know obviously we look a lot of football. I mean, the Premier League is the best example of that, going into multiple different markets, becoming the most watched football league, even more so than their own domestic leagues. Do you think if any of the other football leagues want to compete with the Premier League, this is a great opportunity to try and compete?
To try and compete in terms of joining
viewership, sort of viewership, because obviously, essentially, when it comes to the broadcasting rights, it all comes down to viewership, right? So the reason why the Premier League does so well in broadcasting is because of its international viewership, and a lot of the other leagues across Europe. I'm thinking more European at the moment. are heavily like, so a lot of Italian people will watch Serie A, but not many other, well, especially in comparison to the Premier League, not many people outside of Italy watch as much Serie A. And so I'm thinking if, like, say, a Serie A could be positioning themselves in the US market, especially because there's actually a big, in some states in America, there's a big Italian sort of contingency. There's a lot of people who have descendants from Italy. So, like, do you think that that could be an opportunity for, like, not just clubs, but for actual leagues and governing bodies to be expanding their operations and to sort of really grow their sort of brand internationally?
Yes, I do tremendously. So, for instance, you mentioned Serie A. So, yeah, I mean, little things like coffee comes from there in the sense of like the coffee lifestyle. I mean, Starbucks, the idea for Starbucks, Howard Schultz was the founder of Starbucks. He got the idea of Starbucks, the inspiration from Starbucks from a trip to Italy. So I think little things like that, like trying to create a brand around. So you mentioned, is it best to go towards a league approach or a club individual approach? I think that's what you're getting at in terms of like what would be the best strategy to penetrate into the US market. I think it depends on what league you're talking about in terms of Serie A. So if you're talking about, the Serie A, like the first league itself, it's definitely better to actually go as a collective. Why? Because the league itself has a very strong brand name. The clubs there have a lot of history, from Juve to the two Milan clubs and the other clubs there. But the most important thing, like I said, is basically trying to use the history of Italy to try to create an association with the Italian base there, or sort of like lineage of Italians that have been there, who obviously have tremendous reach in terms of like the association. So a lot of pizza shops in different parts of the US, pizza is a normal sort of like consumption behavior. So associating the league with those sort of like symbols that communities around the world are well aware of, especially the US with its high consumption habits. So that would be the approach, as a collective, go there. And that's what the Premier League has done. Collective approach as opposed to individual approach will be the best way to penetrate a very strong market as US. And don't forget, this is the way the MLS does things. The MLS uses a collective approach when it comes to broadcasting rights. This is why the league is actually surviving. Without this, the MLS would not exist. This is a fact. You can ask the people who obviously established the MLS to begin with. They needed to have a collective sort of approach in terms of trying to establish the league to begin with. But in terms of trying to penetrate the US, it would be the best approach would be a collective approach. Build from that, have very strong commercial partners, and then obviously, naturally, the clubs who feel like they're bringing more value to the table would eventually want to negotiate higher sort of like higher sort of like revenues from these partnership deals. And that would be another, issue to tackle, challenge to tackle when they get there. But the collective approach would be the way to go for me.
No, I agree. I think a lot of football clubs sort of the football industry is very strange, because a lot of other industries, it's like your competition failing is a good thing, whereas obviously you need other football clubs to play the game. Like the success of if all the football clubs are doing better, it actually helps the whole the product in itself. Having a one football club that just dominates every year isn't the best for storytelling. It might be for them, they might feel successful and everything because they keep winning, but in terms of like the actual attraction to the league, people like the idea of this could be our year. I mean, that's literally like the slogan for most football fans, is like, this could be our year. And yeah, so I feel like there could be a real big sort of expansion in the American market. It'd be really interesting to sort of see where that goes. Do you see any sort of downsides to sort of the Americanization of the English sort of football Premier? Because at the moment, we're getting really, especially for the Premier League, we're getting really close to an American majority in terms of like the way in which we vote on regulations, the way in which we vote on governance. Have you got any reservations or concerns about this, or do we actually think, do you know what, it's best practice, they know what they're doing from a sports point of view? I mean, the franchise thing, I won't ever come across it. I don't think we should ever be afraid of that. Although it did try to happen with the European Super League, so they're obviously like the idea of closed shop. Have you got any sort of concerns around sort of over Americanization, or do you think that overall it's a good thing to sort of be going down the same models that they use?
So I think it's like sort of like a hybrid approach when it comes to the Americanization of like capital into football. I mean, first thing to say is like it's a good thing and not so good thing. So it's a good thing. Why? Because private equity specifically, they come with not just best practices, but they come with like an operational model, which is basically we want to make sure that this institution, this business is heavily focused on returning, return equity, and and also making sure that there's high ROI returns in every operation or every investment we make. And there's obviously the fact that private equity is very focused on having exits in like 5 to 8 or 10 years. So those are the two things that work for football in the sense that there's not going to be this influx of excess capital for no reason without a sort of like a plan to actually get returns based off that model. The not so good thing would be the fact that obviously private equity is not looking at the interest of football. They're looking at the interest of their shareholders, the people who have investment in their funds. So they're not trying to make sure that how can we do things in the best interest of these fans? For instance, Oaktree Capital is currently owned by a private equity. Sorry, Inter Milan is currently owned by a private equity firm, which is called Oaktree Capital. The same, I would say, the same with most Serie A clubs. They have the American issue there going for them. But in terms of seeing it as a specifically bad thing, I would say it's not necessarily a specific negative thing. It's more a thing where the independent regulator, for instance, one, but also the Premier League as a whole would have to consider what are the long-term implications of this Americanization of our sport in the UK, for instance. But as a fan, I would say as long as we don't see massive changes happening in terms of like little things from the color of the jersey, the badges, naming rights, if it doesn't need to be changed because of financial issues, then we don't really see much disruption to where the game is going. And I know the Super League has been an issue, but if I'm being honest with you, I think that's going to happen eventually. You're gonna see a break off of of clubs in different leagues that then form into a different league to try to make sure that they have the opportunities for no punishment in terms of like losing a specific budgeted revenue. So for example, I mean the Super League, the whole point of it was to make sure that they could have the American model, which is a closed shop, and then not have to deal with whether we're going to not meet our specific benchmark or specific targets for specific revenue, or also trying to make sure they could extract as much value from the sport itself. But yeah, looking at it from a neutral perspective, you need to take both sides of things. You need to look at what benefits are they bringing, and we see the benefits. We see Liverpool, the way Liverpool has gone from a club in disarray to where they are right now, which is 2 Premier Leagues, a club that has a very standardized way of operating. I mean, even rival fans know that Liverpool has been run very well. It's a private equity firm, an American firm that's actually running them right now. So yeah, I would say that's the way to look at it. You can't say it's either good or bad. It's both. They have both things going for them.
Bro, no, I think it's really interesting. I think that's before we wrap up, I'd just like to get your overall thoughts on how you think the independent regulator and everything else will sort of play out. Like, do you think it'll have a good influence? Do you think it'll have an or bad, or do you think it will really much just run in the background and not make all that much difference overall? Like, where do you sort of see this? What sort of impact do you think it'll have on the industry, and sort of should clubs be overly concerned about what's going on from a regulatory and governance sort of standpoint?
If I'm being honest, no, I don't think clubs should be that worried. Why? Because they have someone in David Cogan who's actually worked in this industry specifically in terms of like developing the broadcasting rights. So he understands the need for the Premier League to exist. He understands the need for not an equitable sort of like pyramid, but he understands the need for the pyramid to exist in the first place. So I don't think clubs have any sort of like specific worries in that sense. And plus, they have a lot of like capital to burn in terms of trying to try to not necessarily shape the regulation that will come through, but try to make sure that their voices are being heard. So how to relate in terms of compliance relations, how to relate with the independent regulator. I don't think the Premier League is in any danger. I think it's the whole thing's overblown in terms of like, this massive disruption. We need to remember also like the independent regulator only comes into play as a backstop. So the independent regulator, like you mentioned, would only be in the background until there's a need for it, meaning the EFL, the Premier League cannot come to an agreement. And then when that happens, obviously there has to be some outside body that sort of like comes in to make a decision. And best believe that if that's the case, it most likely would be fair for both sides, because they both felt like, we can't give enough, I can't give you enough, or I can't take enough, or you can't take enough for me to make it fair. So I think the whole thing is a good thing for the football industry in the UK, but specifically meaning in terms of like clubs, Premier League clubs being wary that this could be damaging for them, I don't think so. From what I've seen so far, it's a narrative that's come into play because regulation in general it's not looked upon in a good thing. But if you have a regulator that is aware of the industry he's regulating, he understands the needs of each of the stakeholders in terms of David Kogan, then both sides should be fine with the fact that it will be in the best interest of not necessarily each party, but the pyramid as a whole. So whatever happens in terms of like an enforcement or intervention when it comes to his backstop involvement, I think the league as a whole will be better off for it, as opposed to having someone not like him. So if you were to ask me if it wasn't him specifically and someone else who I think they put out different names before he was named, then I would say, yeah, maybe the Premier League should be worried. Maybe they should have even more compliance staff. Maybe this is going to be a disruption for potential investments coming into the Premier League. But this is someone that is well respected from both sides. If you have other guests and you ask them about David Kogan, they'll tell you that he knows what he's doing. A very intellectual person. He's actually worked on these deals, so he's not going to come in and damage something that he created or he helped create to begin with. So that would be my take.
No, brilliant. It's been really interesting to hear all your takes on sort of the opportunities for football clubs, the direction which the industry is going. If anybody's lasted this long through the conversation and would like to hear more from myself and Ibrahim, we'll be doing a live Q&A to answer your questions. You can network with us, and it'd be great to hear what your guys' thoughts are as well. So if that's something that you're interested, there'll be a link in the description below, and we hope to see you there. Thanks again, Ibrahim, for joining us today. And we look forward to having you on for the live Q&A.
Thank you, Joshua.
Brilliant. Thank you.